please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, last talk I gave here was on Fordham Road a few months ago, and this very subway talk was actually given at the old Bronx Library Center many years ago, so it's a little bit of a repeat, but that was at least 10 years ago. So I don't think any of you were there then. This is what I'm going to do tonight is basically talk about not so much how the New York subway was built, but why it was built. And really there were two purposes to it. One was to help the population of New York spread out from crowded tenement districts like the Lower East Side to subway suburbs like this neighborhood in the Bronx, Fordham. There's a handout if you want to, Glenn, I don't know, or maybe, right, yeah, you can just take a pile of them. Maybe. I'll put them on the desk over there. And the second reason the subway was built was obviously to promote the economic development of New York as a business center. Lower Manhattan obviously couldn't survive without a subway system, and Midtown Manhattan really, its growth has a lot to do with the subway system, although a lot of people say it was really more the commuter rail system. That's not true. It was really, if you look at the number of workers who come to work in Midtown Manhattan, there's many hundreds of thousands more come to work by subway than come to work by either the Long Island Railroad or Metro North. Everybody has a handout, or should have a handout, and there's many more copies of them there. I just want to explain the handouts a little bit before I introduce myself. I'm going to be using them. I'm going to eventually put these on PowerPoint, but I've been too lazy to do it so far, and people seem to like handouts. What you've got is two maps. One, the subway system as it was in 1910, and then the second map, is the second page, is the subway system as it existed in 1925, which was pretty much the full build, although after that the independent system was added. And what we're going to be doing is really talking about how that jumble of lines on the second map got built. And as I've always assumed that people can read maps, but some people seem to have trouble reading maps. So what you've really got here is Manhattan in the left side of the map. Manhattan is actually bigger on this map than it really is. That is to say, they made it larger and they made Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx smaller because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to show all the subway lines in Manhattan. But nonetheless, it shows you sort of locationally where things are. And the southern tip of Manhattan, which I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes, was really where the business center and the residential center of New York was from the 1620s on. Some part of Lower Manhattan has been the center of the whole region actually for almost 400 years since the city was founded and settled for the first time by Europeans in 1624. And then north of Manhattan, obviously, is the Bronx, which was always seen as the natural place for the growth of New York City and seen much more than Brooklyn and Queens as part of New York City. Because the growth in Manhattan was predominantly to the north as the city grew, and then it spilled over into the Bronx. And in fact, this area of the Bronx that we're standing in right now, or sitting in right now, was actually annexed to the city in 1874, well before the rest of the other boroughs joined New York City. So this place was part of New York City for much longer than the rest of the city, and that's because it was the natural thrust of development was to the north. But by 1898, Brooklyn and Queens and the eastern part of the Bronx had joined the rest of the city to form the city of Greater New York. And the way most of the people have gotten traditionally to work in the Manhattan Central Business District, south of 59th Street, or about south of a third of the way down Manhattan, was by this extensive network of subway and elevator lines that were built, as I say, mostly by 1925, but there was a whole other system called the independent system, was built between 25 and 40. And following the maps, you've got two tables that I'm going to talk to in a minute. One is shows the population of New York City. Yeah, I think she has copies, extra copies. There you go. Which is the population of New York City from what I call the beginning of time, or 1790, which is actually when the first federal census was taken. And the way you read that table, the 33,000 number up in 1790 for Manhattan means that New York City in 1790 had 33,000 people. Those numbers are in thousands. So it had existed as a city since 1653, as a settlement from 1624, but in all those years it had only grown to have 30,000 people. And then the other places, including what's now the Bronx, this area here where we're standing had 2,000 people in 1790, obviously an unpopulated place. And the other boroughs, which were later added on, had also small amounts of people. So what's now the city of New York, let's say the 5 boroughs, only had less than 50,000 people in 1790. And I'm going to be talking to this table because if you look at the numbers, they go up very rapidly from the 1820s on through actually 1940, or 1950, when New York City reaches its previous high of about 8 million people. It's actually now a little higher than that. But it's really to accommodate that growth that you got an extensive rapid transit system. And then you have other tables that follow and some illustrations that I'll talk to throughout this talk. Well, I'll do a little introduction myself as to how I got involved in this. And I think the best thing to do if you have any questions while I'm talking is to actually just raise your hand and I'll try to answer them right away. I'll try to save some time for a question and answer period after also. A lot of people ask me how I got involved in studying the history of the New York subway and eventually wrote a book on it called Tunneling to the Future. And it really goes back to the fact that I lived on this very block that we're on now in the apartment house up on the corner, 2544 Valentine Avenue, for 20 years, the first 20 years of my life. And I commuted from the time I was 16, I commuted back and forth to NYU at Washington Square on the subway, either the D train or the number 4 train. And my father, who worked in Manhattan, did the same thing every day. So eventually, since I was at one point studying urban history, I started asking myself, well, why was I living up here in the Bronx and going to school in Manhattan, and why was my father living up here in the Bronx and going to work in Manhattan, and what connection did the two have to themselves, and why were these subway lines that I used every day built in the first place? And so that's how I started. And it became a more interesting and detailed story than I had thought, including one surprising fact which most people still don't appreciate, which is to say that the subway system was never really owned by private companies. It was always owned by the city of New York, and it was leased to private companies through operation, but it was always a municipal work, and it's actually one of the greatest feats of public engineering that's ever been done. It even rivals or actually surpasses most of what Robert Moses did in the way of highways 30 years later. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. The other thing that I guess I should talk to, and I put notes in the map, is that New York City is, most parts of New York City, except for the Bronx, which is the only borough on the mainland. That is to say, you don't have to cross a large body of water to get out of New York City from the Bronx. But Manhattan is obviously an island. But Brooklyn and Queens are also on an island. Believe it or not, and again, most people don't seem to believe me, they're on Long Island. So Brooklyn, Queens is followed by Nassau and Suffolk, but that's all part of an island. And what that means is that topography really helped determine a lot of what went on in terms of rapid transit development, because the natural growth of Manhattan, as I said before, was to the north because you had great barriers of water, the East River between Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens, and the Hudson River between Manhattan and the unlabeled white blob over here, which was actually New Jersey, which we don't like to talk about, in the history of New York City, of course. But the Hudson River was an even greater barrier, which is why you don't have any subways and why you actually have a political boundary, although that's another story, than the East River. And so that's why the subway lines tended to go through the north. And that's why Brooklyn, which was actually a separate city from 1834 to 1898, was really a rival of New York City for a long time. It was the third largest city in the United States. And you can see by 1910 on this first map, Brooklyn had built a whole network of elevated railroad lines by 1910, just as Manhattan and the Bronx had. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? We're being filmed here, so. Yes, sir.
Are you also given some notes about the Second Avenue, subway, Lexington Avenue, and all that stuff?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the Second Avenue subway hopefully at the end, since it's one of my favorite topics. And one of the last, I happened to, the last thing I did before I came to work for the Historical Society in 1996 was I worked for the MTA, and one of the things I did was help to plan, to do the current plans for the Second Avenue subway. So we can talk about that later.
I used to work for the Port Authority, and also I just think one of the things they didn't consider in that Second Avenue subway is First Avenue could have been a good potential second choice officially, because you know the United Nations, Manhattan's very narrow, just where the United Nations comes in. But sometimes that would be line filled in just like the West Side was, and then First Avenue would cover 2 blocks to the
Right, to the UN, yeah. Well, that you probably should have gone to public hearings about 8 or 9 years ago when all of this was being discussed, because when MTA did the latest study on the Second Avenue subway, which is actually going to, the construction of which should actually start this year. Believe it or not, there's $1 billion in the MTA capital program to do it. There were all possible alternatives, not just subways, but light rail lines and busways and stuff like that were considered as alternatives to the
I
subway.
spoke at the MTA.
Okay, good.
I got all handy.
Okay, good. All right, anybody else? Yes, sir.
What connection is there between the subway system and the water delivery system from upstate for the reservoirs? Was there any planning done that was?
No, there was no planning. Both the water supply system in New York City, which is the water supply, if you're going to say which is the greatest public works projects that were ever done in New York City, it would either be the subway system or the water supply system. And they don't have any direct connection with each other, but they do have a direct connection with why people in Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island, yes, Staten Island actually, which is off the map here, but actually voted to join New York City in 1896 or 1897. There was actually a vote taken, and they became part of New York City. Hi, Larry, we got we got a handout if you want it. The reason that the outer boroughs voted to become part of New York City was because by the 1890s, the government of New York City had proven itself competent to build the public works that would deemed to be needed in a modern city. And that included subways and water supply systems and streets and sewers and bridges and schools. And the local governments in Queens were seen as not competent to do that. They didn't have the expertise. They did have some expertise in Brooklyn, and in fact the vote to join New York City was very close in Brooklyn, but it wasn't close at all in Queens and Staten Island. They wanted the municipal services that they saw the city could provide and that the city could finance, which was the second thing. And the two things that had been real accomplishments by the 1890s, the turn of the century, were the street systems and the water supply system. And so in that sense, there's a connection, but there was no direct connection between the two. I've often thought of actually tried to do a talk on the water supply system, because it's also a very interesting topic, but that's another time. Okay, let's go back and ask ourselves why New York City may have needed a rapid transit system. And what you've got to do that is go to the population table, which is the 3rd page, and look at that population of what's now New York City, less than 50,000 in 1790, but that same area by 1860 has over 1 million people, almost 1,200,000 people, and after the Civil War by 1870 it has almost 1.5 million people. And what you had there was the city changing from being a very small city at the southern tip of Manhattan. I mean, they didn't put facing on the north side of City Hall because they never thought there'd be growth north of City Hall in late 1790s when it was planned, which is sort of amazing because everybody knows that there was rapid growth after that. But they had, you know, that made actually sense because, as I said, the city had been around since the 1620s, but it still was very small. And it was what historians call a walking city. That is to say, there was no need to have public transit of any sort, even buses or horse cars, because everybody lived and worked within walking distance of each other. Everything was clustered basically south of Chambers Street in Manhattan. Those of you who know the Wall Street area, it's an easy place to walk around. Residences were mixed in with businesses. There was really not even any segregation between business areas and residential areas so much. There was some slight segregation by income levels. That is to say, the wealthy people lived west of Broadway and the poorer people lived east of Broadway. Even that wasn't that extreme. And what you have starting really around 1810, 1815, and accelerating in the 1820s, is the rapid growth of New York City in population, and the numbers on table 1 reflect that. And the reason for that is that New York City is now part of a growing nation, the United States of America, which was created during the Revolutionary War, but which was rapidly expanding to the Midwest by the 1810s and the 1820s. And markets and people were moving out to the Midwest. And New York City really caught the edge of that wave. It really wasn't a manufacturing city in 1810. It was what most cities had been up until that time. It was a port city, that it was based on the commerce of ships coming in and out, and some stuff coming in by wagon, but mainly ships coming in by water. New York City is the best port on the east coast of the United States. By 1815, it was the largest port in the east coast of the United States. And what New York City, as the country grew and the state grew, was it captured the commerce coming from a number of places. So it became an entrepot, the center of where people moved in and out. There's a handout, sir, if you want to get one down here. What it did first was it captured the trade with Europe, and it did that in a number of ways. One, they started setting up shipping lines that ran on a regular schedule between here and Europe. So up until that time, if you wanted to ship something to Europe, you brought something down to a ship on the docks on, say, Fulton Street, in the Fulton Street area, and you waited till the ship, but you didn't know when the ship was going to leave. It would leave when it was filled. Package ships would leave on a schedule, so people would know that if they put something on that ship, it was going to leave next Thursday and it would be in Europe by a certain day. And that setting up of package ship lines between New York and various ports in Europe really helped New York City to capture the transatlantic trade from rival cities like Philadelphia and Boston and Baltimore. So New York captures that trade. And people bring all sorts of manufactured goods to Europe, furniture that's made in England, and fine silverware, and fabrics, and cloth, and all sorts of things come in to the port of New York. And things also go out of the port of New York. And that's the second thing, well, actually the second and third thing that New York City captures. A famous mayor of New York, who later became governor of New York, around I'm not sure exactly when it was decided, but it was finished by 1825, and my high school was named after it, DeWitt Clinton High School. He was a man who got New York City to build, or New York State to build actually, the Erie Canal. And what the Erie Canal did was it created a water level route from New York City to the whole Midwestern part of the United States. So you could, instead of having to take, say, a barrel of flour or a barrel of wheat from Ohio and carrying it by cart and wagon over the Allegheny Mountains, you could actually put it on a barge and go up to Albany, and it would be taken over to Buffalo, or put it on a barge in Ohio and go to Buffalo and could be taken to Albany and then down to New York City. And what that does, because water, the cheapest way of transporting something, it was to ship things by water. What it did was it reduced the cost of shipping an item of goods, say a barrel of flour or a barrel of wheat, by 100 times. So something that would cost $100 to ship now became $1, or something that would cost $1 now became a penny. The same thing, because of the cheapness in the shipping by water. And as a result of that, New York captures the trade coming from the Midwest and going out to the rest of the world, but it also captures the people who were in the Midwest want these fine things from Europe, and so things go up the canal also and go to the Midwest. And then a largely unappreciated thing that New York did, in addition to carry trade to the Midwest, I mean, what you basically had in the United States by 1840 is three main regions in the United States. One, the whole northeastern part of the United States, including New York City. One, the Midwestern region that the Erie Canal captured. But you also had a very large and wealthy group of states in the South, in the southern states, based on a very exploitive labor system called slavery, which produced cash crops like cotton and tobacco and rice and indigo and a whole bunch of other crops that made a lot of money in Europe. And New York captured the trade. It's hard to imagine, but it did. It captured the coastal trade going down to places like South Carolina and Georgia, so that the cotton going to Europe didn't go directly to Europe, it came through New York. And the fine goods that the planters who owned plantations, who were growing the cotton or the tobacco, they wanted fine goods from Europe, and that came through New York. They were factors, agents for the southern planters that would make arrangements and handle the whole deal. I mean, New York became the deal-making place. So New York captured the trade with the southern states. So New York's wealth is based on this tremendous growth in commerce that goes on from about 1810 through the 1860s and the 1870s and actually continues to today. It's the first sort of main economy that New York has. And then, in part as a result of the fact that it captures all this trade, what do ships need? What do sailors need? Ships need things like rope. They need barrels. They need all the things that sailors use, like clothes. So most sailors didn't have wives that could make their clothing. So what happened was companies were founded in New York to make ready-made clothing, including jeans, the things that most Americans now wear jeans, but they really were working-class clothing that sailors wore. And instead of being made at home, now they would be made in factories and sold more cheaply because you could cut things into pieces and you could have a bunch of people put them all together, and then you sold them on stores across the street from where the sailors were, and they'd buy the jeans and the shirts and stuff like that, and the shirts were much cheaper. So you started getting manufacturing, and the garment industry starts in New York at this time. That later becomes the major industry in New York by 1900, where New York is making garments for the whole world. It's certainly the whole United States, if not the whole world. But it starts here based largely on the needs of the port. And many other types of factories start up, like people who make barrels. What's a guy who makes a barrel called?
A cooper.
A cooper, right. So coopers were making barrels, and all sorts of things that rope, rope is an easy thing to make, so roper, I guess, is people who make ropes, common name. All these types of things started to be made, and then it got so much that even the ships that the Americans were using, which had been before that largely made in France and England, they started saying, well, why do we have to buy the ships overseas? We can set up dockyards, and they did, just north of the Lower East Side, on the East River, in your map over here. We're sort of north of where the tip of the Lower East Side is. That's where the first docks were set up, and then later they moved across to Brooklyn in an area that was what later became the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where they actually started making ships for the American Navy. So you have everybody going up the manufacturing ladder and trading back and forth. And people who are trading and people who are manufacturing, what do they need? They need transportation. Okay, but the transportation system's set up. What else do they need?
They need warehouse space.
They need warehouse space, right? So the large areas of the Lower East Side become warehouse. But they also need credit, a finance system. You got a guy in England, you got a guy in New York, you got a guy in South Carolina, you got a guy in Ohio. You have to have a banking system that deals with all these people. So as a result of the fact that you have all this commerce and you have all this manufacturing that's growing, and manufacturers who, some of them started out as private companies, but then they started to incorporate so that people would pool their money and start factories. Actually, that pooling of money started for ships because it reduced the risk. If you owned a ship yourself and it sunk, you lost everything, whereas you shared with 100 other guys 100 ships, and 10 of them sunk, you only lost 10% of your money. So people started to incorporate. And what you need to do, in addition to just letters of credit from overseas and from the Midwest, you also have a way of borrowing money, and banks, what do banks do? Banks make money on lending money. So you had the start of banking on places like Wall Street. The banks were. So Wall Street, by the 1820s and the 1830s, gets set up as a financial district. And then once you start getting people incorporating, and corporations sell what to get money? Stocks and bonds, right. Well, then you need a place to trade the stocks and bonds. So what happens? You get the New York Stock Exchanges created before the Civil War in the Wall Street area. So the third leg of Manhattan's economy, one being the commerce from the port, and the second being manufacturing, and New York becomes the nation's largest manufacturing city by 1860 and stays that to the 1950s. But the third leg is this whole finance and insurance related. Insurance is always very closely related to finance, and that all becomes headquartered in the Wall Street area. Okay, well, so Manhattan's economy is booming. When this city's economy is booming, what happens? People come to New York City, right. There's places, here's where you can make money, and people came to New York City from the rural parts of the United States, especially from upstate New York and New England. Many of the traders and the merchants were from New England, including a guy like Seth Low, who becomes mayor of Brooklyn and then becomes mayor of New York later. They come from upstate or New England. But what about the guys that have to do the work on a day-to-day basis on the ships, or working in the factories, or fixing the streets and building the streets? Well, there's a limited supply of people coming from the American countryside, and so people start moving here from large parts of Northern Europe. So much so that from the 1830s on, there are large numbers of immigrants coming here from places like Ireland. And from Ireland, they're coming in part because there's opportunity in New York, and they're also coming from the fact that from the 1840s on, there's a potato famine in Ireland which causes many people to die. I mean, Ireland only has about 5 million people now. In 1840, I think it had 8 million people. So you have this huge population loss. So a lot of people who are really going to starve to death or not be very well off, they get on the cheapest ship they can find, and they come over to New York. And they're joined by people from lots of other countries, the second largest group being the Germans. Most of the Germans come here with a little bit, before the Civil War, but with a little bit more money in their pocket than the Irish, and so a lot of them set up small businesses, and a lot of the breweries in New York by 1860 were set up by the German community. And that growth in population is so large that by 1860, those 814,000 people living in Manhattan, which was all of New York City was in Manhattan at that time, half of them, 400,000 of them, are either foreign-born or the children of foreign-born, and a quarter of the whole city's population is actually children of people from Ireland. So you have this large immigrant community in New York that's really providing the fundamental labor force for all of this growth that's going on, building the streets, working in the factories, things like that. Well, so you get this growth in population, and as a result, partly as a result of that, you also get a lot more differentiation in terms of income levels. You really